Welcome back to the program. You're listening to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. We're the daily business news program from Business in Vancouver newspaper and BIV.com. I'm Kirk LaPointe.
I'm Tyler Orton. Joining us today is Iain Black. He's the CEO of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. Iain, you've got some expansion plans that you're going to share with us, but first I need to thank you for joining us on the program today.
Gentlemen, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
So tell us what's going on with the World Trade Center in downtown Vancouver.
Well, we've been working on this for about 2 years now, and to cut to the chase, we have for 40 years owned the franchise of the World Trade Center here in Vancouver. There are 324 of them around the world in 89 different countries. We have owned the one here in Vancouver for over 40 years, and 20-odd years ago, it went dormant as a service-providing entity.
Yeah.
And having achieved some of the wonderful successes we've enjoyed as my colleagues and I and our board of directors over the last 3 or 4 years, we set our sights on what do we do with this franchise. And so we decided to breathe life back into it. And so actually starting tomorrow, we're relaunching services under the banner of the World Trade Center Vancouver, starting with a really, really exciting training program workshop on exporting.
Yeah, and so it is really designed to accelerate our trade opportunities.
That's right.
In this community. How do you think you can do this in say, the short and medium term?
Well, there's a variety of, first of all, what we learned on this journey. It's been fascinating, actually. We studied this for the best part of 18 months and figure out when we're trying to determine what we're going to do with the World Trade Center. And there's so many different things and services that one can provide in the areas of exporting, everything from trade financing to headquarter retention or attraction, foreign direct investment, trade mission support, and training is one of them. And so we basically said, where do we start? How do we get back in this business? And so partnering with our friends in Toronto, the Toronto Region Board of Trade, who have about an 18-month head start. It's really quite interesting. As a very quick aside, there are a variety of World Trade Centers owned by the Chamber Network and the boards of trade across Canada, and there are 4 or 5 of us doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time because there's an overwhelming need, especially in our small to mid-sized business space, to get more of us exporting. Mm-hmm. So we're starting with training using a program called TAP, Trade Acceleration Program, that we've licensed from our friends in Toronto, which has had outstanding success with every participant that has gone through it, has seen a minimum of 70% increase in their trading activity within 1 year of completing the program.
So what gap does TAP fill?
Well, really, it's about making people understand that there's an investment in time and energy and focus needed if you're truly going to get into exporting. So this is not a seminar. You don't show up for a day, get a nice cup of coffee and a muffin, and go home smarter. This is a 4-day intense workshop over a 5 or 6 week period where the content providers are some of the top experts in the various elements of exporting from both the private sector and the public sector, and they work with you in a mentorship capacity to develop a trade export plan. It gets vetted, it gets reviewed, and by the time you come out of this 6-8 weeks later, you actually are now ready to start the actual processing. And it's not for everybody. It's for people who are trade enabled or trade ready small businesses.
Yeah, well, I have to ask, what did you learn from Toronto when it comes to the market for this? You said it's not for everybody, yep. So who do you want to target specifically?
And that's a really, really important question, actually, Tyler, because what Toronto realizes when we talk, the phrase that gets used is trade ready, which means a small business that's got a minimum of $500,000, if not $1 million a year in revenues. We're not talking about startups in people's basements. They've actually had some experience running a small business, got some of the rust out of the hinges and got the kinks out of the business. So they've got some momentum. They've got an established product and a customer base, and they're ready now to take that next step. So that kind of pre-qualified client, if you will, or student is a very important part of this. You've got to be an established small business that's ready to take this next step and has the ability to dedicate 1, preferably 2 people to a 4-day workshop. But for a small business, that's a pretty big deal to give up that much time. It's 2 days back to back up front, and then a few weeks later there's the 3rd day, and a few weeks after that is the 4th day.
So what do you suspect had been happening here, Iain, if in fact there is this gap that's there? Were we just as a region not necessarily capitalizing on the export opportunities? Were people hitting a ceiling? Were they just fumbling their way into things? Were there mistakes being made? What do you think this speaks to here in a way?
Well, the data is pretty clear on this. I mean, British Columbia has about 13% of Canada's population, 18% of Canada's immigrant population. And that actually, the immigrant population piece is actually quite important because immigrants have a higher propensity to start a small business and sell products and services back to his or her home country because they know how it works back home. Yeah. So that data is quite important. So despite having 13% of Canada's population or 18% of the immigrant population, we only have 8% of Canada's exports, right? So we're punching way below our weight as a national average. And yet when you look at the opportunity, what's been happening with our GDP growth as an example, our exports have not kept up. If our exports had matched the rate of our GDP growth over the last 10 years, we would have seen $43 billion with a B, $43 billion more just in British Columbia of exported products, goods, and services by our small business sector to other places in the world. So the data is really, really clear. We're just not at the party, and we believe a lot of it is education and awareness, and frankly, to understand what incredible natural advantages we have based on where we are located.
But are we hearing concerns about uncertainty over, say, things like NAFTA that's going on right now? Is this going to be a factor for a lot of these small businesses, however way it shakes out in the future?
Well, NAFTA is certainly a bit of a red herring, there's no doubt. Most of the data I just shared with you is from the last couple of years before the shadow of NAFTA and the kind of the Donald Trump rhetoric around it kicked in, to be fair. But notwithstanding that, you have to remember that British Columbia, unlike every other province in the country, we only export about 52 to 53% of our exports go to the United States. The national average is around 80 because most other provinces, notably Ontario and Quebec, they're over 80% to that number one customer of ours, America. In British Columbia, we deliberately diversified our trade away from America over about a 15-year period, starting around 2001, 2002. So we now have got great markets in South Korea, in China, in India, still doing a lot with the UK and Europe, of course, and with CETA coming into play, there's enormous opportunities as we now have unfettered access to 1.2 billion people. I mean, it's crazy, the opportunity that exists there now. So we're actually at a wonderful crossroads, even with some of the uncertainty around NAFTA, that the world is our oyster, and we're not fully equipped to take advantage of it, and that's what TAP, the Trade Acceleration Program, is all about.
Yeah. Do you believe then that the program that you can institute here is going to either maintain or even broaden the diversity of the trade opportunities that we have out of British Columbia? Because you're quite right. I mean, we have a very large quotient going into Asia. We have a large amount even going into Europe, surprisingly, in this province. And we don't have the same reliance, almost a dependence on cross-border trade with the U.S.
Well, I think it'll depend on the participants of the program, if I want to focus specifically on our World Trade Center's TAP program. Because when I think of some of the success that they've seen, our friends in Toronto, when they've run this, there was a software company out of Mississauga who had been selling $300,000 or $400,000 a year of their software licenses into America. And, within 8-9 months of completing the TAP program, they're doing $1.5 million that they weren't doing before. So there's one example of a particular product or service that had a market that was geographically, right on their doorstep. It would be different, for example, when we speak of agri-food producers in the Okanagan. The famous example that Craig Richmond, the CEO of YVR, that he loves to use is, cherries that were picked in the Okanagan yesterday are on our lunch table in Japan tomorrow. Again, speaking to the natural advantage that we have from geography and just the trade infrastructure that we have here in the West Coast. So I think it'll be kind of circumstantial, to be honest, Kirk. I don't think there's going to be one obvious market for one obvious product. But having said that, we are doing a very important piece of research with the World Trade Center as we breathe life back into it over the next 18 months. Thanks to a partnership with the BC government, we're actually doing a really important piece of research on what we call internationalization, big fancy word. And basically, it's taking the next step in our scorecard, which was the regional view, not just Vancouver, but the 22 municipalities that comprise the Lower Mainland, and studying it as a region, not as a bunch of little municipalities, and understanding our strengths and weaknesses. That was our scorecard 2016. We're redoing that 2018, May 2018. That'll be announced or released via the Conference Board of Canada. But what we're doing right now is in parallel with that is we're studying our region from an exporting standpoint using the Brookings Institute out of Washington, D.C., and again, working with the Conference Board of Canada and some really great people locally. We're studying our region to say, what is it that we sell awfully well that's in high demand in other jurisdictions, and how do we help connect those dots and go to some of those small to mid-sized businesses that are in that space and say, did you know that your product is in really, really high demand in, let's say, Vietnam? And so we're going to be pretty proactive on that once we get that data established.
So essentially, capitalize on maybe the manufacturing sector that you see in Surrey versus the agricultural sector that's maybe not being capitalized on in the Tri-Cities area, for example.
You're absolutely right. So it would be sector specific, and the government's done some great work on this already. We're not going to reinvent the wheel here. There's some amazing work that's been done by some of the economists in the government of BC over the last decade around identifying what they call clusters. Well, this takes it just that next step and really puts that international view and starts to link up cities, buyers, and sellers. And then from that, I suspect there'll be some great services that the World Trade Center Vancouver will be able to offer as well.
Yeah, you started the conversation by talking about all the World Trade Centers that are around the world. How does having a program like this actually, though, also help us as a region in terms of our relationship to all these other centers? Does having your TAP program really then make you a different kind of player in that space of all the trade centers around the world?
It will help. It will help in a couple of different ways. The World Trade Center represents 750,000 businesses around the world. And as part of the wonderfully humbling experience of just studying it and understanding it, this neat little asset we had called the World Trade Center, one of the things that in some of the trips I did out to New York and meeting with the World Trade Center Association there is, I came back to Vancouver and I got a phone call from the executive director of the World Trade Center in Florida, who had a client in Vietnam who wanted to buy a particular pork product that we actually make here in British Columbia that I didn't know anything about. And so he's phoning me with a client in Vietnam to get carton loads of this particular pork product that he wants to send to the Philippines. So it was almost a surreal phone call.
So you're part of a club now.
Yeah, it's incredible. And the conversations go back and forth the way all of us would sit here and talking about, the score of a Whitecaps game or a Canucks game, because it just flows so effortlessly for people who are very fluent, then who understand that small business drives a lot of the world's economics. And it just takes organizations like the World Trade Center and programs like TAP to actually make all that happen.
Iain, before we let you go, if somebody wants to find out more information on TAP, where should they go right now?
The Greater Vancouver Board of Trade has got 2 websites set up as part of the subsidiary, if you will. One of them is TAP BC, that's TAP, so Trade Acceleration Program. So tapbc.ca, and then WTC, so World Trade Center, WTCvancouver.ca.
Excellent. Iain, always a pleasure having you on the show.
Gentlemen, thanks as always.
That's Iain Black, CEO of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. You're listening to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. I'm Tyler Orton.
And I'm Kirk LaPointe. Stay with us here.